pocket prayer materials to everyone. If you weren't here, there's a basket on the little stand back by the prayer wall. Feel free to pick up your little case and insert. If you've used your insert, you want to add some more, pick up another insert and carry that with you as a reminder of what you intend to be prayerful about. Just a little tool to help us do what we're talking about. We are studying prayer, not because we want to understand prayer better, not because we want to know the subject better, but because we want to be better subjects of prayer. And so that's our objective and that's our goal. We've had several lessons thus far. We've talked about the fact that there's probably a universal need for us to improve in our prayer lives. We looked at 6 original language Greek words that are used and sometimes translated as prayer, and how those different words increase our understanding of the subject. We talked about perhaps what hinders our prayer, and one of the things that I shared with you is that I think any element of our flesh that stands in the way becomes a distraction to prayer. It leads us to a hindrance of our prayer life. We looked last time at the admonition that Jesus, at the question Jesus answered when he was asked about teaching them to pray. He gave no real in-depth lessons on it, just 5, if you will, laser targets regarding prayer. He basically points out that prayer needs to glorify God, that prayer needs to recognize and submit to the game plan of God. It needs to involve thankfulness for God's gifts. It needs to seek His grace because the petitioner is extending grace to others. And it also needs to have a full trust in God's guarding. And that's where we have gotten to thus far. Oxymorons. Did you know that the word oxymoron is an oxymoron? It's actually a compound from the Greek language. The first part, oxy, meaning sharp, and the last part, moron, meaning dull. So it's a dull sharp, which is an oxymoron. And it just amazes me the kinds of things that we use almost unknowingly that are really oxymorons. The fine mess, good grief, really, okay. An unbiased opinion. Definite possibility. We just use them all the time, and I think most of us are well aware of them. Here's a couple of visual ones. I don't know what you're supposed to do there. And then there's this. Nothing is written in stone as it's chiseled in stone. So I think we've all encountered oxymoronic incidences in our life. We've got mixed signals. We deal with contradictions. We've faced inconsistencies. We've experienced a lack of clarity and perhaps a sense of ambivalence. We all understand what those situations are. And I think most are aware that just recently there was an announcement regarding our Shopko stores here in Lincoln. And I'm confused because the one just down the street from us, it still has this sign up. So I'm not sure what that means. And now this morning they even now have a going out of business 30% off sale sign that's stuck out in the parking lot. So that even makes it more confusing. So we all know what that is. Now, what I want to address today is how sometimes the very essence of our spiritual communication with God appears to be filled with the same. Sometimes we are confused. Sometimes it appears that we're getting mixed signals, that there's a shortness of consistency, that there's a lack of clarity, and maybe that there's just absence. The book of Lamentations obviously is a real downer book. But did you catch the lament that was read for us this morning? The author said God had shut out my prayers. Ever felt like that? Like your prayer's been shut out. I guess to put it another way, have answers to your prayers ever felt left you confused and puzzled and bewildered, disappointed, maybe even angry? A couple of true stories. That handsome crew cut there is my 12-year-old Dew, sitting on the lap of my Grandpa Ross. He was a retired farmer by the time I made the scene, but he still played on the farm, and I got to play with him. So we had a pretty special bond. I don't even remember what was happening, but I remember that Grandpa went to the hospital, that my folks left me with some friends, and they went to Mitchell, South Dakota to be with Grandpa Ross. I don't remember if anybody said something or if I sensed. This was serious. I just remember that. And at 12 years old, I remember laying on a sleeping bag on the floor in my friend's room, and I remember praying all night long. That's not a 12-year-old imagination at work, because for my birthday or Christmas, I had received what was then the latest in illuminated watch surfaces. So I may have dozed, but I remember watching my watch all night long as I prayed. And I prayed one thing. I just prayed one thing. The next morning I was told that Grandpa Ross had died. I prayed one thing all night long. But the amazing thing was, at 12, I don't remember that being a big disappointment to me. I mean, his death was a disappointment. But I don't remember being disappointed about my prayer not being answered. Maybe that says a little something about the faith of children. I don't know. 16 years later, my father-in-law has an inoperable brain tumor. Now I'm mature. So I don't make the same prayer that I did at 12. At least not all the time. There were occasions where he had these great days and it was like, oh, maybe God's healed him. But within 30 days of diagnosis, in his terms, he waited for his co-pilot and he made his eternal journey. I do remember being very disappointed that time. Now, the only reason I wanted to share those two stories is not because I thought I could make it through them without shedding tears, but I don't think there's anybody in this room that doesn't have similar stories. And I also believe that it doesn't matter if you're 12, 8, 3, 2, or 105, it doesn't matter. We all have the same disappointments in answers that we received or did not receive, as the case may be. A little bit of history. You remember when Moses was leading the people of Israel? And there were numerous occasions upon which the people became disgruntled with him. And Korah led a rebellion against Moses. And as a result of what Scripture says, they're contending against the Lord, which is a sermon in and of itself. God caused the earth to open up and swallow up the entire family of Korah. Well, I say the entire family. There apparently were some either too young to join in the discontent, or maybe there were older ones who refused. We're not told. But there were some that were spared. And we know that because there are descendants of Korah that are talked about in the rest of the Old Testament. So it's interesting that 7 generations later, it is this family that actually is the family from which Samuel enters into history. So Korah's rebellious family brings on Samuel. It's also some of the Korahites that were among the mighty men that fought with David as Saul was contending to seek to put him to death. They were also a group that became the doorkeepers and the custodians for the tabernacle. Heman is a gentleman who was named as being a very important singer and was involved in the choral direction of the tabernacle music. The family played significant roles within Israel's Thanksgiving celebrations when the ark was brought to the Jerusalem temple. 11 psalms are attributed to them. They pen some of the most remembered phrases that are in your head from the Psalms. As a deer pants for the water. That came from the sons of Korah. Be still and know that I'm God. That came from the Korahites. Or this, God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. Came from the descendants of Korah. Point I want to make, the descendants of Korah were not spiritual slouches. For generations, they have been at the forefront of great significant spiritual happenings. We're not talking about fringe Jewish Israelites. We're talking about core people whose belief motivated their service to God. Well, they authored another psalm. And I want you to get your Bibles out because we're going to look at this psalm, and I want you to be able to find it again and look at it in, whether it's your paper Bible or your digital one. Psalm chapter 44. The heading says that this particular psalm is a maskil. Don't really know what that term means. Scholars debate the identity. It is supposed that since it is possible that it comes from a Hebrew root word which means to teach or to have insight, it is supposed that it may mean this is a psalm to memorize. So that may have been the significance of that phrase. And if you have a Bible that has headings on it, it may give you some of that explanation. Okay, let's begin in verse 1. God, we have heard with our ears, our ancestors have told us the work you accomplished in their days and days long ago to plant them and drove out the nations with your hand to settle them. You crushed the peoples. For they did not take the land by their sword, their arm did not bring them victory, but by your right hand, your arm, the light of your face, for you were pleased with them. You are my king, my God, who ordains victories for Jacob. Though we will drive back our foe, through your name we triumph our enemies. For I do not trust in my bow, and my sword does not bring me victory. But you give us victory over our foes, and let those who hate us be disgraced. We boast in God all day long. We will praise your name forever. Selah. Okay, there's another Hebrew word. We don't really know what it meant. It may have been a musical term. It may have meant rest. Most scholars believe that what it does is it basically calls for a time to take a breath. In other words, we've said all this, now there's a sigh. Listen now what they record. But you have rejected and humiliated us. You did not watch out with our armies. You make us retreat from the foe, and those who hate us have taken plunder for themselves. You hand us over to be eaten like sheep and scatter us among the nations. You sell your people for nothing. You make no profit from selling them. You make us an object of reproach to our neighbors, a source of mockery and ridicule to those around us. You make us a joke among the nations, a laughingstock among the peoples. My disgrace is before me all day long, and shame has covered my face because of the voice of the scorner and the reviler, because of the enemy and the avenger. All this has happened to us, but we have not forgotten you or betrayed your covenant. Our hearts have not turned back. Our steps have not strayed from your path. But you have crushed us in a haunt of jackals, and you have covered us with the deepest darkness. If we had forgotten the name of our God and spread out our hands to a foreign God, wouldn't God have found this out? Since he knows the secrets of the heart, because of you we are slain all day long. We are counted as sheep to be slaughtered. Wake up, Lord. Why are you sleeping? Get up. Don't reject us forever. Why do you hide yourself and forget our affliction and oppression? For we have sunk down to the dust. Our bodies cling to the ground. Rise up. Help us. Redeem us because of your faithful love. The psalm starts out, great praise for God. And then it's, where in the world are you? If we'd been unfaithful, you'd know it. But we haven't been unfaithful, God. We've been right here. We've been steady. Where are you? Why are we being ridiculed and reviled? Why are we being downtrodden by our enemies? Where are you? Jump to the time of Christ. Mark chapter 11. Last week of Jesus' life. There's a lot of pointed instruction that Jesus is giving that he hasn't up until this point. I suspect, driven by the element of time and the shortness of it, that he is feeling pressure to give lessons more intently. Jesus replied to them, have faith in God. I assure you, if anyone says to this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will happen, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, all the things that you pray and ask for, believe that you have received them. And whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, so that your Father in heaven will also forgive you your wrongdoing. Sometimes we, I think, express our desires in full faith, and God answers yes. We would remind ourselves of King Hezekiah. 2 Kings 18 is where it says there's not been a king like him, either before or after. Spiritual giant, Hezekiah. Hezekiah turned his face to the wall. In verse 1 of 2 Kings chapter 20, we are told that he is terminally ill. And his response is he turns his head toward the wall and he prayed to the Lord, please, Lord, I remember how I have walked before you faithfully and wholeheartedly and have done what is good in your sight. And Hezekiah wept bitterly. And Isaiah had not yet gone out of the inner court when the word of the Lord came to him. Isaiah's delivered the message that he's not going to recover. Hezekiah prays, and before Isaiah gets out the exit door, God tells Isaiah, okay, go back. I'm going to give him 15 years. He gets a yes. Sometimes your petition gets God's yes. Sometimes our petitions get God's wait. We need to remember a few things about that. One is that one day is as 1,000 years with the Lord. Time is not an element. Time is our element. And so sometimes we view waiting as being this immense sacrifice in which God is just tearing. With God, there is not a time element. And so if God answers wait, it's because he sees a much bigger plan than we do. Jeremiah chapter 29 is a good expression of waiting for God. I know the plans I have for you. Do you know God knows the plans he has? He knew the plans he had for Israel. He knew what he was going to do with Israel. But God knows the plans for each of us. And so if the answer we get into our request is wait, it's because God knows us. Because God knows the plans he has for us. Another factor is that there may be influences that create delay. But there are powers at work that are beyond our understanding that at times apparently interfere with our prayers. The example of this is shared in Daniel chapter 10, When Daniel had petitioned God, and now we find out the response. This angel appears and says to Daniel, "You are a man treasured by God. Understand the words that I'm saying to you. Stand on your feet, for I have now been sent to you." After he said this to me, I stood trembling. The angel says, "Don't be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you proposed to understand, to humble yourself before your God, your prayers were heard. I have come because of your prayers." Here is a heavenly being saying, "I came because of your prayers." Verse 13, "But the prince of the kingdoms of Persia opposed me for 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to me, and after I had been left there with the king of Persia, now I have come to help you understand what will happen to your people in the last days, for the vision refers to those days." Daniel had prayed about a vision, wanting to understand a vision. God heard his prayer and sent an answer, but there was an interference. I just know what it says. That's all I know. I know that we do not struggle against flesh and blood, but we struggle against the principalities and the powers of darkness of this world. That's all I know. There's a level perhaps of understanding of this if we look at the life of Job. We see heavenly beings involved in that trouble, that persecution. And so maybe in a similar fashion, something happens in prayer. The long and the short of it is, there may be reasons for wait other than God's reasons. Even Paul in the New Testament will talk to the Thessalonians. Remember, he had been there only 3 Sabbaths, founded that congregation, wanted to go back, longed to go back. But he says, "We greatly desired and made every effort to return to see you face to face." But what happened? So Satan hindered us. Again, I don't know what Paul means, don't know what happened, but that's what he says. So there was another power that was at play in fulfilling that spiritual desire. Sometimes God answers yes, sometimes God answers wait, and sometimes God answers no. I think you need to understand, and I need to understand, that when we get a no to our prayer, we're in really good company, because the Bible is filled with examples of people that got no responses to their prayer. And perhaps one of the easiest and most profound is Paul, because he 3 times asked God to remove a thorn in the flesh. And I think you need to remember why Paul wanted the thorn gone. He wanted it gone because he thought he could serve God better without the thorn. But what actually happened was Paul learned how to serve God better with it. And so God gave him a no. I pleaded with the Lord 3 times to take it away from me, but he said, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is perfected in weakness. Therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weakness, so that Christ's power may reside in me." Paul got that message. I want to go back to our Mark passage. The history of that passage is the day before Jesus told the disciples that he had come to that fig tree that had the appearance that it would have figs on it, and it didn't, and so he cursed that tree. The next morning, as they go back into Jerusalem from Bethany, this tree is all wilted, and that's what has caused the disciples to ask questions, and Jesus then responds about the power of prayer. "Therefore I tell you," he says, "all the things you pray and ask for, believe that you have received them, and you will have them." You know, there are several passages in the Bible that talk about things like, if you ask, you'll receive. Passages that tell us, keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. And we read those passages, and our normal interpretation is, if I am diligent in prayer, and God tells me, he will answer that prayer. Now, how that gets muddled up is we also believe that if we pray to God, he will answer that prayer the way we want the prayer answered. And there is none of the texts that say that. But that's what happens in our heads, is we believe that when Jesus is admonishing us to ask with all faith, he's saying, I'm going to hear your desire, and I'm going to give it to you. But is that what he's asking? Is that what he's saying? Is that how he's telling us to ask? Let me just call your attention to this passage, and I looked in every major translation into English, and I don't believe that, I'm not remembering that there was a single exception to this. Do you notice that there's a past tense here? I tell you, all the things you pray and ask for, believe that you have received. Oh, what does that mean? Jesus here is not giving us a guarantee to grant every prayer request that we have. Is there anyone doubts that? Is there anyone here has been, everything you prayed about, it's been given to you? I mean, you had faith and you prayed about it and boom, God did it just the way you expected him to do it? That's not what Jesus meant. It's not what any of us have experienced. It's not what any of the biblical references that we might look at would reference at all. We may not get everything asked for, but the point is we've already gotten everything we need. That's the point Jesus is trying to make. When we ask within that caveat, we always have what God sees that we need. We always have it. Nothing wrong with making our requests and our petitions before God. That's what Philippians says. Do that. But we do that from the standpoint of knowing we already have what we need. I've already received. So I make the request. I read this statement that as I was studying, that I just found so telling. Prayers of faith don't root themselves in the problem. Now you think about that. Say to this mountain, move, and it'll happen. And so often our prayers focus on the mountain. We focus on the problem. We focus on the trouble. Prayers of faith emulate from the conviction that the Supreme One has already delivered the solution. You know, as I process all this, I looked at some of the other passages, the other believing you receive passages, and I think they're saying the same thing. James says, but let him ask in faith without doubting. The doubter is like the surging sea driven and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. What's he talking about? Well, if I don't believe I've already received everything that I need, then I'm doubting. Or Matthew chapter 7, keep on asking, keep seeking. Why? Because the Father gives good gifts. And the point is, when I'm asking, when I'm seeking, God is always giving me what is best. Luke chapter 18, that unjust judge says that God will grant justice to his elect. And 1 John 3, receive whatever we ask from him because we keep his commands. My request is heard because I have what I need. I have his commands. I have what he said. Each of the three answers to prayer hold a possibility for easily being corrupted. For example, you know, even getting a yes to prayer can really send us down the wrong path. You know, we can develop a certain level of self-righteousness. We know that James says the prayers of a righteous person avail a lot. So if I've prayed and I've got a yes, guess what? It's easy to do. It's easy to think, hey, I got the yes. My prayers were pretty powerful. What's that make me? I must be a righteous person. No, that's not what's supposed to happen here. Getting a yes should drive us to be like the scene in Revelation. Thanks to the one seated on the throne, the one who lives forever and ever. The 24 elders fall down before the one seated on the throne, worship the one who lives forever and ever, cast their crowns before the throne and say, do you know what casting your crown before the one who sits on the throne means? You stop being your own king. It's not about how righteous you are. It's about how good God is in giving you the yes. And so you throw off your crown. You humble yourself and you exalt God. That's what's happening in heaven. That's how we need to respond when our requests are answered with a yes from our God. It's obviously the wait and the no answers to our prayer that open that door to disappointment. Hopefully, we've seen today that some of the hinges upon which that door swings have very little to do with God's response to our request and more to do with us prior to our prayer, prior to our request. Where our heart is, not necessarily the lack of divine response. I want to close with this passage. Often quoted, often memorized. You probably learned it as a kid. Hebrews 11 and verse 6. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Great passage. The one who comes to God. Doesn't say prayer, but let me just throw out, prayer is one of the ways that you come to God. It's one of the ways I come to God. But if I'm going to do that, I must believe that he is. I must believe that he is. Some translations say that he exists. Yeah, but that doesn't really reveal so much what the Greek word esti means. It's the word is. And the meaning of this verse, what is really important. Because it's the Greek verb of being. It's much like the Hebrew expression, I am. Where God told Moses, you tell him I am sent you. The being sent you. That's much what is contained in this Greek word. It was used by philosophers as they debated and discussed the meaning of life. What is? What is? Their discussions attributed it to both space and place. Thus, when I come to God, James says that I come to God, I must believe that he is. He is the possessor of all life means. He is the deliverer of absolute truth which life needs. He is the one who fills every space and place of my prayers by himself. He is. He is. When I make my requests known to God, it's because he is. He's not my candy God going to give me everything I ask for. He is. What did Jesus do in the garden? He prayed to his Father. Did he tell the Father what was on his heart, what he wanted? Absolutely. How did he do it? He is. God, if there's any other way, let this cup pass. But not my will, but your will. Maybe now, after looking at some of this morning, you maybe are being given a challenge on looking at your disappointments in prayer a little differently. I want to give us all just a moment to maybe address that with our Father. If our disappointments have been laid on him, well, maybe that's not where they belong. Maybe we have been a little inconsistent.